Good evening. I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the many-voiced American literary tradition a vital part of our culture. A special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our mission. 2022 is Library of America's 40th anniversary year, which we'll be marking with special events like tonight's program. Please check our website, loa.org, for updates. Octavia Butler, whose stunningly original and eerily prophetic science fiction now seems indispensable, would have turned 75 this year. Her visionary 1979 masterpiece, Kindred, one of the landmark American novels of the last half-century, transformed the genre and opened new possibilities for American writing. To explore her work with us, we're incredibly fortunate to welcome Obie award-winning playwright Branden Jacobs-Jenkins, who is adapting Kindred for television as a limited series airing this fall on FX and executive producing it as well. The novel is found in Octavia Butler, Kindred, Fledgling, and Collected Stories, volume number 338 in the Library of America series, edited by Nisi Shaw and Jerry Canavan. And our producers will drop a link to the book in the chat. We're grateful to our partners for this evening's program, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, Beacon Press, the Hutchins Center at Harvard University, NYU Skirball Center, and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Branden Jacobs-Jenkins plays include Appropriate and An Octoroon, winner of the 2014 Obie Award for Best New American Play, and the Pulitzer Prize nominees, Gloria and Everybody. His TV credits include consulting producer on the HBO series Watchmen. Since 2019, he has also taught playwriting at the University of Texas at Austin. He joins us from a friend's home in Connecticut, I just learned. A reminder that we invite questions and comments. The Q&A button is on your menu bar. Please let us know where you're calling from, where you're viewing from when you leave a comment. Okay, Branden, welcome.
Hi,
it's
Max.
Good to see you.
Yes, very good to see you. How are you? Sorry, this is like the busiest room I've ever been in my life. I have to just apologize. This is not normally what it is, but I'm squirreled away trying to write. So,
well, I was thinking, the first time we met, I mentioned that we were at work on a Octavia Butler edition, and your eyes lit up immediately. And so I have to ask you about that. How you discovered Butler, what drew you to her work, and to Kindred in particular, if you want to say.
Yeah, sure. I think that first meeting was staged by the amazing Catherine Sterling, because I felt part of my job was to come there and advocate, and I was so shocked to hear that the Butler was already in works. But I discovered I grew up, my entree into sort of literature was actually people who kind of flirted with that border of like literary and sci-fi or literary and some genre, and the kind of gateway drug was Ray Bradbury, and I mean who also is the Library of America author, and I don't know, I just spent I feel like my idea of what writing could be started with Bradbury for some reason, and I read everything I could find by him. All my friends, we all read Bradbury. It was really ridiculous. And I had a babysitter at the time. Her name was Kimberlyn Heller. She's now a very important physician in Portland, Oregon. But at the time, she was an undergraduate at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And she kind of, I think one of the first days that she kind of came over to babysit, she noticed all the kind of sci-fi on my shelf. And she was like, "Do you know about Octavia Butler?" And I didn't know who that was. And she kind of went home, and the next time she came back, she handed me these like pocketbook kind of paperback versions that are now pretty iconic and hard to find of Octavia's work that had been published at the time. And it was the first time I'd ever seen like a person of color on the cover of a book, and I was sort of like a little intimidated, and the books that I started with were the Patternist books, which began with Wild Seed and kind of traipse, through many centuries and actually kind of forms. And I was just super hooked. And Kindred at that time wasn't a part of, because Kindred isn't quite considered hard sci-fi in the way that the others she also debated being called a sci-fi writer for a very long time in her career. But the things that were available at the time were the Xenogenesis trilogy and the things that felt like space opera-esque, kind of world building type stuff. And Kindred at the time was, I think, only in print through Beacon Press, which was like a feminist, like kind of almost academic press at the time. That's how it was treated. So I didn't actually encounter Kindred until much later when I was in college. And it was at that time kind of taught really regularly on kind of women's studies syllabi and African-American studies syllabi as almost kind of like a curiosity, And by that point, I'd been familiar with her as truly at that point, kind of the only Black woman writing in sci-fi at that level. I mean, she kind of held that title, sadly, for decades, it felt like. But I remember reading Kindred for the first time in college and kind of resisting it, I think, in retrospect, because I think it lacked the fun or the entertainment value of some of those bigger world building pieces. But it's a book that I found myself thinking about for years and years and kind of returning to. And it wasn't until I was maybe in my mid-20s that I had the aha moment, and also kind of realized, and by that point as a human being on the planet, I had learned much more about my own family's sort of genealogical, body of narratives about how we came to be. And very famously in my family, there were two kind of stumps in our family tree that ended with essentially a white parent siring a child with a Black parent, and that child either being abandoned on a step, literally, or being kind of raised as one of the children of the master. And I felt like this was the first book I'd ever read, because of course I was at the time, and it's still now, Toni Morrison sort of Beloved is the book that I think most people think of as the touchstone of an American author taking on the complexities of slavery. And I guess this was the first book I'd ever read that was interested in just the moral complexity of the story of slavery, in the sense that, it's called Kindred because everyone was related. I mean, the underside of that kind of horrible economic practice was the exploitation, the breeding of human beings, which, as when you go back and look over Butler's kind of oeuvre, one of the major themes that she's interested in is sort of like the phenomenon of procreation and forced procreation and breeding. And anyway, I was like, oh, this is the only book, honestly, that I felt like I'd ever really dealt with in a way that I could grasp. Not just, it wasn't sort of it wasn't quite like the sentimental novels or even the slave narratives that I've been, reading in other classes, but it almost wanted to take a philosophical or intellectual approach and allegorize and think through the ideas behind these practices, that I found that really compelling. And then weirdly enough, flash forward several years later, I was in Berlin on Fulbright. I wound up staying for a couple of years and wound up having this kind of amazing 2 years where I just read everything again and more things. And ironically enough, at the time, I just sort of had a kind of, my debut theoretically as a playwright, and I got an agent. And at that time, television was becoming a thing, and agents were like, figure out what you want to pitch as a television project, find a television project. And, weirdly enough, the two books I read over there were The Watchmen and Kindred. And I was like, I think I want to make these television shows. And then everyone, of course, was like, no, that's never going to happen. It's not going to happen. But it was sort of my Moby Dick. I mean, my white whale for a very long time was trying to figure out how to get people to see the Kindred television shows. At the time, people were trying to make it a movie. And it's her only book that's actually been under option since its publication. And I was trying so hard to track down the people who had the rights. And I was like, it's not a movie, guys. It's a TV show. It's a TV show. And then eventually someone listened, it's sort of, and things kind of, came together quite quickly, but it's taken 7 years, honestly, to develop it. So it's kind of been a long time coming. And of course, in that process, in that time period, it's been amazing to watch Octavia like mainstream or somehow. Like it feels like when I was originally starting out, people were like, who is this? Who is this random, again, like curiosity. But I think oddly, a testament to her gifts is just like with time, the richness and depth of what she was doing kind of becomes clear to people as we like develop the language to address it. And it's been kind of amazing to even her induction to Library of America. I don't think that was even a blip in the mind, 10 years ago, but now it just feels like a obvious, like, duh, great. This is it,
Right. Well, and I do want to ask you, probably maybe a little bit later, I mean, we do seem to be in an Octavia Butler moment in many ways, and we should talk about that a little bit, but I think you just, that answered like the first 5 questions I was going to ask you, but which is good. I was going to ask you to, I mean, I don't know if everybody on the who's watching has read Kindred. I was going to ask you to describe it and also ask you what the resonances were of the title, but probably the one thing we should say about it is that it's a time travel book, and brilliantly a time travel book. That is to say, is there any? I can't think of any other book that's as brilliant a use of the device of time travel. As expressive, not only in terms of its thriller plot, but in terms of its expressivity of the themes, because it's about generational.
Trauma.
It's about the relationship of the past and the present in a way. So just talk a little bit about that. I mean, how you see that working in the book.
Yeah, I mean, it is, like you said, it is somehow the most elegant and like use of time travel as a metaphor, I would argue, out of like all the kind of things you could think of ultimately. And I think that there's there's 2 phenomenons I feel kind of compelled to talk about, which is I noticed that as coming up as a playwright, there was an interesting like schism between like my white colleagues, my Black colleagues, and that we all, even though we all went to the same schools and we all had the same training, and we all had like the same stuff, there was like this rite of passage that every Black writer had to go through where they had to address history with the capital H. And it was very confusing, but it was this interesting like idea that like a Black author always has to like give context to the novelty of their speaking, and then starts with like narrating history itself. Oddly, it's like a very odd phenomenon in that way. And I also felt like there was a real I think I spent a lot of time with her papers at the Huntington Library, and I really wondered a lot about like where this book was coming from for her, and it was actually conceived of as initially, I believe, and someone can like completely refute me in the footnotes, but but it was supposed to be a part of the Patternist books, actually, that she had sort of decided that it was going to that originally, as conceived, Dana was one of Doro's children. If you know those books, you'll know what I'm talking about. And she had sort of realized somehow in the process of working on it that this book had potential for her to cross over into literary space. Like I think she realized that there was something about the way that she was sort of elevating the time travel tropes that sort of define, sci-fi is filled with time travel stories or things about descending time. She sort of realized very early, like, oh, there's something happening here that is like slightly more elevated or metaphorical about what I'm working on. I think she was super attuned to that. Deeper about, and I think it is ultimately also about like, I think that she was arguing in some ways that, and again, she's writing in like the middle of the 70s. So roots is like is barely a thing. We're talking about a time when there are incredible strides being made even in the scholarship surrounding slavery, right? Because up until then, it had been sort of warped and dominated by like completely racist thought coming out of the academy in the early 20th century. So, there's a rediscovery happening of the idea that people in this country had like historical roots, had like a narrative to tell, like literal roots, And I think that there is a kind of working metaphor in this about a young woman sort of going through the experience of being racialized and kind of coming to understand, the richness of the story of her being present or something. Like
Right.
it's hard to, I'm feeling like I feel like I have to write a book to describe what I'm sort of talking
Right.
about, but I think that's what it is. I think it's this notion
Right.
that, like, for a lot of Black Americans, there is this shame around history, or like a disassociation from it, because it's such a painful thing to really go back and think about, or it's a thing you can't even access. I mean,
Right.
I remember I every year I'd be a sucker for those like ancestry.com like sales, and you go on them, and there's people in the commercials are always like wearing like lederhosen, and they're like, I'm descended from like 14th century barons, but then with my family, every time we did it, we'd get stuck on our grandparents because there's just no written record, right? And
Right.
there's such an intense sense of migration, and so it feels like you get as far back as you can, and then you're just staring into an abyss, and I think that that's sort of the ontological experience that Octavia Butler is like capturing in this,
Right.
right? This woman had no idea about the story of herself, and this is the story of how she figures that out. And then once she figures that out, reassessing her own complicity with power, how, that everybody's family story is a tragedy and a farce,
Yeah. Well, and it's an unsettled, I mean, that's just to put it mildly, it's an unsettling experience for her. I mean, she says, I don't feel safe. Her first response is, I don't feel safe. It could happen any time. In other words, this life, which seemed to be fairly placid in this new house in Altadena, suddenly it's not at all that. There are these fissures opening everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, I want to ask you a couple of things about adaptation, I guess. And I mean, one question is, so how do you approach, like, when you approach the book in terms of adapting it? I mean, what is the first thing you think about? I mean, do you think about structure and story arc? Do you think about narrative point of view? Do you think about the world that you have to create? I mean, how do you approach it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I felt, anything I adapt, I'm kind of always approaching it as a fan first. Like it's usually like a thing that I, in my incredibly geeky way, just want to see, and so I'm always motivated by this notion of trying to find the echoes of the author's intentions inside of the form that I'm working in or trying to translate it into, and I feel like with this book, I knew that one of the things about it that was just like most successful was this concept of how, the time that she spends in the past is actually much more time than passes in the present, and that the kind of dysphoria that ultimately happens as she kind of lives both in the past and the present at different paces. And this notion too of a person going from not just naivete to like wisdom, but in the process of wisdom, becoming numb in some ways to violence and to the reality of kind of evil, basically, And I was like, okay, that's it. That's what I need to figure out how to build out in this form, is the story of someone who goes from naivety to wisdom with a cost that is like almost bodily. It's almost like physiological, ultimately, what happens to her. And and that's what actually accounts for why the longer she stays in the past, the exponentially harder it is for her to get home. I was interested in that. And I knew that would challenge television, because television is about comfort and like, you want to know what's going on from one episode to the next and what to expect. But I had to sell people on this idea that, as the show progresses, she's going to stay in the past is going to eat up our screen time, and it's going to be like getting into a warm bath here that's ultimately filled with acid, So how do we kind of make this happen as reality? And then I also have to talk, people often, I had a very amazing brief period in my 20s where I like worked for fiction editors and was very involved in sort of the mechanics of prose fiction and storytelling. And it gave me just like a really amazing, I learned how to read all over again through that process. And it's made me very sensitive to just the differences between the pleasures of a novel and the pleasures of television, and how those things are related to formal choices. And in novels, what's always masked is the authorial eye. What's always taken for granted is the story is being told to you in the written form, right? So it's always past tense. Storytelling, you know, because in order for the text to exist, it has to have been written down, meaning the events described have to have passed. That's just like the essential nature of storytelling on the page. Whereas film and television, even drama, the illusion is always like a perpetual present tense. Everything is happening in present tense. So I had to sort of find a way into the book that allowed me to tell it present tense. But also what I realized is the book itself is a first person retroactive memoir.
Yes.
And that allows you to kind of question, you know, of course, when we read Kindred, we believe the narrator, you know, that's the pleasure of the book, but it gave us an interesting opportunity to see why she might be omitting the things she's omitting, or like what's happening in the periods where she says like 3 weeks past, you know, suddenly there was like kind of corners of the room to occupy in a different way. And that's where I think the television version begins to kind of take off. It's almost like an expansion of the universe in some ways, you know, but also remembering that every choice we make creatively, I have to take my cue from something in the book. And, you know, Octavia's work is so dense actually with concept and thought. And you can tell like when you go through, I think she just kind of was a bit of a graph mania. Like she wrote and wrote and wrote, and she edited and edited and edited. But like when you look at that material, you see that she went down so many, you know, paths in the forest. And then after the end of the edit, it's like one sentence. It's one very good detail. But when you're kind of in the writer's room and you're kind of teasing through this text, you go through that door and you're like, oh, there's a whole episode in this detail, you know, that still gets us back on the kind of path of the story. So it really is about like honoring the text, expanding the text, you know. I don't know if you know, another famous television adaptation of a kind of feminist sci-fi classic is obviously The Handmaid's Tale. And I was always fascinated, I love that book too, and I was fascinated by how they kind of ripped through all that material in one season. You know, and they were in that. And so I was always like, I guess I get that, because similarly with like Game of Thrones, people are so tempted to spoil things for themselves. So as a television or dramatic writer, you're like, how do I get ahead of that? You know? And I think I decided to take another tack, which is like, I think if you know the first of all, we're doing things that are going to be very controversial, but we've sort of done some rewiring of the book. But like, I wanted to make an experience where it's like, if you go back to the book, it's not that you're spoiling anything for yourself, but you somehow like are enriching your experience of the storytelling, if that makes any sense. That's my approach.
No, it's quite interesting. It's very interesting. I mean, you talk about the book as if the story it's Dana's arc. And I'm curious to know how you conceive that. You talked about that a little bit, but also, I mean, the book is very much Dana's, as you say, point of view, and there are very intense scenes where you can imagine the point of view shot, you know, in the river, you know, the gun pointing at me, you know. Yeah. And I'm wondering, does that figure in the way in your handling of it? I mean, are we going back and forth between Dana's point of view and, as you say, this broader context, which gives some insight and context into what decisions that she's making?
This is a big, you know, kind of conceptual debate that we had in the writer's room very early on. And ultimately we decided that the camera is hers primarily, you know, this is her story, but part of the thriller aspects, I think, of the book, I mean, this is, again, everything we're doing is a cue or take from the book, is about, and why a first person is so powerful is it's always about what they don't know. You know, it's always a search to know. And so we chose, I mean, who knows, again, we're like still in the writer's room, so I think it's gonna be different in like 6 months, so please forgive me. But we did make this choice that like the camera can only privilege her experience in the past. And then, you know, spoiler alert, when Kevin gets pulled back in the past, it's sort of, the camera follows him a bit too. And that becomes the kind of ways that we interface with things. But no, there's no scenes where we're like in the bedroom with Margaret, you know, there's none of that happening. So, you know, but I think, let's see, this is the challenge we set up for ourselves, because you're right, most television takes that kind of like omniscient third person approach to things. And here we are with Tony Soprano, but here we are also with Tony Soprano's enemy. And, you know, we do the dance back and forth, but we're going to really try to honor the novel's kind of emphasis on point of view, you know.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to get back to Kevin, the husband, in a second.
Do it.
But before we go there, so, you know, Butler famously did a lot of research for Kindred to try to get the textures and the facts right. And obviously there's a big challenge here of actually visually presenting this world from the past. And I'm curious, what you have, what about that? What about the research, and, where did you really have to dig in to do that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, I'm a research nut, and we have about like 3 or 4 researchers. We're actually hiring a new researcher, like I think momentarily, to help us out here, because it is, keep in mind that it should not be undervalued that she was doing an incredible amount of research at a time when there was nothing. Like, she literally, I think it's 75-ish, 76, she's writing this book. I mean, there's just not the scholarship we have now. These academic departments are just starting. No one is actually dedicated to sort of reviving this, this body of like kind of almost forgotten or lost, firsthand experience. I mean, she's literally putting it together herself. She's taking, it was like literally I think the longest trip she'd ever taken in her life was a bus across the country to Maryland to sort of see these places and kind of visit these towns, And so I think we have a comparatively like 1 million times easier time reconstructing for ourselves what that world was. That said, I think too, something that also shouldn't be overlooked is that I believe that she very specifically was trying to expand the cultural imaginary around slavery. Meaning, I think film and television have done more damage than anything to kind of create the cliches we now associate with slavery. When you say plantation, the average person imagines like a Neo-Greek, Greco revival, like 2 columns, white, cotton fields. But I think she very specifically said it in Maryland, and she specifically said it in a Georgian, because I think she said it in like a border state too. So we're talking about Maryland, which famously, like, one of the issues of Maryland is it had a ginormous free Black population, which was a huge problem for people trying to keep their slaves and their slaves or enslaved. And you're talking about like a much more complex dynamic, not just between Blacks and whites, but like Blacks and Blacks, that would not necessarily be on display if she'd set this in like Plantation Alley, Louisiana, or even Birmingham. And I think she's I think it's sort of implied that what they're actually like a whiskey distillery type farm. It's just very interesting what the choices she made to kind of give us a different sense of the average plantation. And so for us, we just followed those leads. I mean, we have an amazing production designer, Jerry Fleming, who is like obsessed with the textiles. He's looking at the heritage colors. I mean, and we're taking cues from her, but like, it's all clear that she did all this work. I mean, the colors the fact that the slaves are wearing the color blue is very important, historically, in terms of like the availability of blue dyes and their fashionability. It's kind of wild. And there's also this other kind of subplot that is very shadowy in the book about Hannah, this first wife of Tom, who lived there, who we're supposed to assume he inherited that home from, and just the layering of what that family would have been versus him. I mean, Margaret is kind of pulling in from the influx of Irish immigration. I mean, Octavia did all this. She kind of figured out a way to kind of metaphorize a broad sense of how that population was transforming in real time, and how the economics are changing the game, and hence the Methodism and I mean, she's really, it's wild. She lays it out for you. She gives you the breadcrumbs, and you just follow them, and they take you to kind of the bigger idea. But that's just a testament to how I mean, she was truly a genius in that way. I think genius is synthesizing kind of fact into new form. That's what she was doing in like almost a Platonic sense, I would say.
That's really interesting. We'll talk, you mentioned the violence, and obviously, from the very beginning, the very first image in the book, of course, is Dana's severed arm, and every episode involves some kind of violence that pulls her back into the past, and her arc in a certain, goes from observation to identity in a way. I mean, she's a spectator at the beginning. She watches it on TV, and then she's drawn in, and the violence is there to make us uncomfortable, and to unsettle us, right? But famously, Butler also said that she had to pull a lot of the punches. That if she had put on the page the brutality and violence she actually discovered in the research, no one would read the book. And I'm curious how you and your team wrestled with that, because obviously representing the stuff visually just raises the stakes of that question. I mean, it's much, as you say, you're in the present. It's even more powerful to be, and it implicates, you know, the viewer almost in a different way than the reader is implicated in reading the text. So how did you deal with that? With, on the one hand, you know, the goal is to make people uncomfortable and just say to fight against cliche, but on the other hand, you are making a TV show. You have to, you know.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think I have a lot of response. I mean, this comes up, by the way, all the time, right? and this is maybe some of the more uncomfortable experiences of actually developing it, because, you know, on the whole, this is not even the network I'm with now, but all networks are conservative in that way and afraid in that way, you know, because the idea is like, how do I get people to invite this back into their home every week? I mean, that's just the essence of television. It has to be something a world I want to come back to. Right. So if it's traumatic, I don't get why I'm being traumatized, why I'm choosing to be traumatized every week. It's a very different relationship than a novel, which is a private experience. You pick it up when you're ready to, you know, it's a very different thing. I would say that for me also, this kind of goes back to that, like, expanding the cultural imaginary around slavery and its depictions, because I feel like, again, when people think of slavery, they're waiting for the scene where someone's like chained to a post and they're whipped, right? But I think what she was doing is that happens in this book, you know, it happens a lot in this book, you know, but she's also asking us to consider the ways in which the other forms of violence that are happening around. It isn't just that the crime, the horror of this institution is not just simply that people were trained to post and beat, but, like, you know, it operated on the bed of sexual violence. Yeah, you know, that's kind of one of her broad, and it's normalized. You know, that's what she's sort of pointing at in some ways, but also the ways in which that violence is actually used to enforce another kind of more psychological cruelty. You know, that it ultimately is about, like, how do you? It's not, you know, as you say, I don't want to make a show that's like a beating of the week. Right, but I'm curious about really creating a conversation around the ways that violence manifests in multiple ways, you know, against the body most certainly, but also against the body and the mind, which is a part of the body, right? And that's kind of the interesting invitation of TV versus film, because in film it's 2.5 hours, you get what you can get out of it. But I think with TV, because it's really about characters and time you spend with them, you can see people transform under the yoke of these things. You can see the kind of ways people compromise with themselves or are broken or not broken by the culture of violence that they're immersed in, you know. And that's sort of like how I step into that conversation, or I try to, right? And it's been kind of very powerful to, you know, part of the process of developing this is you kind of show to people, you get feedback, and you have, you know, groups of people, strangers watch it and talk about it. And one of the things that really kind of blew my mind in this process was learning how many, because I am a cis man who watches shows like a cis man, that's just what I do, but how often women viewers are expected to identify with or project themselves into a character who is just being raped, and as if it's dramatically interesting. And I never kind of saw that until this experience of, like, oh, that's not, like, why are we assuming that that's an interesting thing for a female viewer to be subjected to again and again to prove a point? You know, there's got to be different ways to think about, you know, violence itself, like what violence ultimately is, you know. And I guess for me personally, I struggle with, you know, there's a great body of work out there about slavery that uses slavery as its subject matter, but I always struggle with, like, when we start to aestheticize the violence, like, you know, what's that perfect frame that makes the whipping look so beautiful? I find that's like an ethical thing for me, right? You know, because it somehow belittles the, you know, unarticulable and unbeautiful experience of that subject in pain, that subject suffering. To call someone suffering beautiful is like, or make it beautiful, feels disrespectful to me or something, if that makes sense. You know, so that's the point of view I'm bringing to the world of this, hopefully. Yes.
I'm noticing in the chat, several people are interested. I mean, I'm curious also how you feel the scenes that are in the present day. Of course, in the novel, present day is 1979. And in fact, the whole book takes place between June 9th and July 4th, 1976, probably
Mhm.
not accidentally.
Yeah.
So I guess a couple questions. I mean, how do you see those present day episodes functioning in the book? And then if you can say, does your adaptation bring it up? Does it make the present now? Does it
Mhm.
keep it as a historical 1979? And what does that decision entail in terms of, you know?
Yeah. Well, so so one of the big things I'm going to get in trouble for is we've actually brought the story out of 1976, and we have brought it closer to our present day, but I don't necessarily want to say exactly when,
Okay.
because I felt that she was writing a book that was contemporaneous to her experience. I feel like whenever I'm honestly adapting things in general, this is even my theater practice, I always fear the moment when an audience can like hold it away from themselves and call it a museum piece. So I'm always trying to like bring it into people's laps and see that and get them to sort of, again, hear the echo of that author's intentions in the form. And in terms of the present day scenes, like there's two kinds of sets of those in the book, right? One is this sort of almost like claustrophobic, like haunted house kind of scenes, which are to me an interesting, because the house is also not fully moved into, right? It's almost like this kind of, they're sitting inside a commodity that in some ways represents, home ownership at that time, representing the American dream. And I think that they're living in like a metaphor, their sense of respite exists inside of home ownership in the 1970s. And then there's these other present day scenes, which are actually the story in real time, told through flashback, of course, of her marriage to Kevin. And that experience of, I think people kind of don't, I think that when you read the book, you're not actually supposed to be obsessed with Kevin when you first meet him. She kind of makes him weird. He's kind of presumptuous and arrogant. He wants her to like type up his manuscripts, but actually the evolution of that storytelling in present tense is the story of what that love looks like, what that kindred spirit is,
Right.
And because I felt like in television, it would be too confusing to be like, we're going back in time, we're also flashing back inside the flashbacks, before the flashbacks, we decided that we want to figure out this way to tell that story in more real time in the present tense,
Right.
But again, over the course of the book, and I think in the series, we spend less and less time in the present day, right? Because again, the past eats up the present. That's sort of the thrust of the book itself, or it re-imbues the present with something.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, so let's just talk about Kevin for a second. So the I don't know what to call them, not utopian moments, but the respites, the hopefulness of the book seems to reside in really two different places. One is in her relationship with Kevin, which is also the relationship of two writers, which is interesting because the scenes of books and writing and reading are the moments of hope in the book. I mean, both
danger.
But I mean, her connection with Rufus, now, which we have to talk about also, but that comes about first through the reading of Robinson Crusoe, et cetera. And then there's the teaching of the children how to read, which of course gets her in trouble also. But I guess I'm curious, how are we supposed to feel about Kevin? I mean, there is an ambivalence there. They're on the one hand, as I say, their relationship seems to be like a utopian moment. And yet he seems creepy at times, and his eyes are compared to Tom Whalen's at one point. And he seems, I don't know, unpredictable in his use of force, himself. How do you read that?
I think in the book, I find Kevin, and I know a lot of people share this too, like there's something that he reads very uncomfortably for a lot of reasons. One is, I think in the book, he's like 12 years her senior, and we're sort of asked, and there's a kind of like paternalistic energy to him that I think in the 70s didn't read as glaring as it does now, right? And I think also he feels like a complete like outsider, like a dweeb, like a weirdo, like he's like, and I think the story is ultimately about two weirdos finding each other. I mean, even the physical descriptions of Dana in the present tense of herself are like, she's not particularly beautiful. She's handsome. She has short hair. She doesn't sleep. She's like addicted to caffeine pills. Like they're not, it's not supposed to be like a beautiful storybook couple by any stretch of the imagination, you know? And I think that Kevin, it is about this dance of how much to trust him. I think there's a constant fear that he is going to get lost in the past, or that he is Tom, or that he is Rufus. You know, there's actually like always there's a weird reading of this where it's actually a love triangle between Rufus and Tom and Dana, you know. And what is it about him exactly that's actually different? You know, how does he wind up actually being the kindred of the title, really, more so than her actual blood, which is every other character that she encounters, right? People forget that like Tom Whalen is technically her grandparent too, you know? And so he in some ways embodies like an abstracted kind of whiteness to me that I think is sort of interesting, that you're supposed to be like, well, what do I do? Who is this person? Also has no real identity, you know? He's just sort of like an artist. He's like his artiness transcends something. And I think that the Dana sort of aspires to or tries to kind of co-opt for herself, maybe. And I do think that there's I always think it's interesting that reminds me of that Alison Bechdel book, Fun Home, where I feel like the experience of it is like, oh, this is her book she wrote finally. You know, when you meet him at the top, he has written all these books. He's a superstar. He's making tons of money. He gets caught in the past. He comes back. He has that moment where he can't even stand the sight of his own writing, you know. But meanwhile, in the process of this, she winds up writing her first book. That somehow going through this experience allows her to achieve a kind of artistic power that he wasn't capable of, you know. And I think that's always sort of an interesting. That's such a complex like setup to me, you know.
That's really interesting. No, that's interesting because of because it makes the book a kind of closed loop in another way, because the plot is also a closed loop, which is to say she has to go back to the past to rescue herself.
Yes, that's right. I mean? That's exactly right. And there has to be a reckoning with history, you know, in order to achieve like nirvana or whatever you want to call this, you know.
Yeah. And what about Rufus? I mean, you know, how do you deal with that? I mean, obviously it's one of the more, I don't know what to say, uncomfortable,
totally.
And yet, you know, I don't know, revelatory. I mean, you know, aspects of the book is the fact that, you know, for a while there, at least, you know, she has this relationship with this
kid,
you know, that looks like it could actually, I don't know, I won't even say it, but I mean, how do you deal with that? How do you read it, and how do you deal with it in this?
It's kind of, I mean, honestly, I think it's one of the most compelling inventions or things that she figured out. I mean, it's almost like Chekhovian what she does with this character, who we really witnessed his entire life, essentially. And we ask ourselves about like what innocence is, how is evil a thing, how does it evolve? And it's all, you know, there's also, I think, a reading of the book where it's like, had she not intervened, and in some ways his obsession has to do with the kindness she showed him in his youth, right? That there's almost this reading of it where it's like, had she not been the kind of like counter force to his mother, who is like neurotic and overprotective and insane, and this toxic father, would he have ever developed this desire for Black women that would express themselves so violently? You know, that's she's interested in like entanglements. She's like, what is, when I think I'm doing good, what happens when there are effects to my good that are ultimately bad? Like, what do I make of my own kind of operation inside of this kind of corrupt system? Is there good inside of any corrupt system? And I think that's where he's the site of that conversation, because there was an attempt to put her energy into educate the child, and he'll grow into a man. But somehow the act of that educating is actually what triggered this bad guy, you know, ultimately, you know, by the end of the book. So it's really, it's super interesting. And I think we're gonna hopefully, you know, we're not actually a limited series, by the way. We're sort of an open-ended series, but we're hoping to see like what that opportunity presents to certain kinds of actors, you know, or to the kind of world of the show in general.
I'm scanning for questions, but I have a couple of things I wanted to ask you, just kind of as kind of I guess final questions between you and me. You know, one is you Jerry Canavan in a book, a monograph about Butler, talked about the fact that in her journal, she talks about wanting to write a yes book. That a lot of her books she saw them as no books, and she wanted to write a yes book, and she wrote, "Love your readers, say yes." And what's interesting to me about one of many things interesting about Kindred is on the one hand, I mean, if you could look at it as a no book, which is to say, you could say it's about how easy it is to be acclimatized to slavery. And in fact, Dana says that over and over again. She says, I was shocked at how easy it was to get used to it, and then you have the children that are playing field hand and auction block. And you have and Kevin slips in, as we said, Kevin slips into his role as a master awfully easily, without a lot of prompting. And in the Whalen house comes to seem like home more than, as you say, this metaphor they're living in the present. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, the book is a kind of liberation story. I mean, she kind of goes into the past to rescue her family, and does that successfully. So I guess one of the things I'm curious is, you've read the book now many times. Do you see it as kind of a yes book or a no book? Is it? If you know what I mean. If you know what I mean.
Does a yes book mean sort of like it's hopeful, or has like some kind of, what does that mean?
I guess, yes, I'm like, sorry, exactly what she meant. I guess that's what she meant. Or that.
Yeah. I mean, well, it's a book about love at the end of the day. That's what I think maybe she meant. It's at the end of the day, she and Kevin still have each other. They still, and they go through this like horrible experience, but in the process of it, they're able to meet each other as fuller humans. And you kind of you ask yourself, well, what's the next thing that happens? She writes her book. I mean, she gets what she wants in some ways through this process. And it's a horrible process, and there's like bodies on the ground, but there is some sense of a net positive, oddly enough, for the two of them after this book is over. So I guess it is kind of a yes book in that way. I mean, all of her books, though, kind of, to me, gesture towards hope, but it's always a hope that's not clean. It's earned. It's a thing that you have to like choose to enact in your life to give it value. I'm thinking of the parable books, very specifically here, which are kind of the last ones there. So I think she was sort of like a really intense realist in that way. I think she just was like, and I think she kind of stared the American project back in its face. And I think she asked not just whites, but blacks to think about, like, what does it mean to, whether or not your family chose to be a part of this, by living here and choosing to live here, you are entangled in a historically problematic enterprise.
Yes.
And so I think she always hated this idea that people would take a stance as if they were morally superior to anyone without examining A, like what morals are, and B, how little they have to do with ideas of superiority, or hierarchy. So I guess this book is the one book where I feel like, we were talking a little bit earlier about how I think Fledgling in some ways is like this weird bizarro twin of this book, or like a kind of like that she kind of revisits some of this territory later in her life. And that book is not particularly, love is not a thing in that book, right? Like love manifests itself as like a symbiotic, blood attachment. I think this is weirdly the one book of hers that has like a lofty romantic quality to it, so maybe that's what makes it a yes book, that there's hope, there's a hope and love happening in Kindred, even though it's nightmarish, it's still a nightmare worth having or something. Right.
And the characters who can't bear the reality of that morally compromised and self-betraying complication, like Alice, end up dead. And I mean, and Alice is the other side of Dana. I mean, she looks like Dana. She's Dana's twin in many respects. There seems to be an aspect of Kindred in the research and elsewhere which has a pedagogical quality, I would say, as you were saying. There's all this talk of how free passes work, and how this it's almost as if she wants to teach the reader about what what this was all about, and the patrollers, the all that stuff. I wonder if you feel like your show has a similar mission in some way. That's part of the question. And then also to link it to something else. I mean, some of our, fellow citizens these days, want to see less attention paid in the classroom to slavery and to, the history, more broadly, and its legacy. They see that as a divisive thing. And so I guess I wanted to ask, do you see the series as having that kind of, pedagogical is not the right word, but mission, and what do you hope it will accomplish? I mean, in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, there's a famous kind of like thing she scribbled somewhere that I wish I had I printed out as a sticker on my notebook, where she says like, fill it with facts, fill the world with facts, and I do believe that in keeping with this mission of like expanding our cultural imaginary, which is to say our cultural understanding of our history and ourselves, you do want to be like, look what happened here in Maryland. This was another facet of the same thing you're hearing about. Like, I think you always want to build upon our knowledge of the past as much as you can. And fiction has always been a very important way to do that, going back to like the birth of, Greek tragedy. It was all about sort of like trying to give factual heft and musculature to stories that people just took as kind of founding myths. That's always what we're doing. I just also recently randomly rewatched that really excellent miniseries on Chernobyl that HBO did a couple years ago, and it's all about this exact thing, which is like fiction can have there's real integrity to historical fiction. And the best historical fiction understands that it is just in service of the work of propping up history in some ways, or underlining history. And it's funny that you bring, ironically, there's a flip side to the kind of like people who want to pretend everything is critical race theory now. But like, I often get this kind of interesting comment about this show that's like, well, do we really need another show about slavery? And I feel like it's so interesting that like, we're only like a generation later. She was making this because there was nothing on TV. Roots is to this day the most successful television miniseries in the history of television, right? But somehow a generation later, everyone's like, I'm tired of talking about this thing, which people were fighting to like make a thing we could talk about literally a generation ago. And I feel like there is something about like, there's nothing divisive about saying something happened. You know what I mean? Why is this statement of fact divisive? That's actually the kind of conversation that, you have to kind of have. But at the end of the day, like, I do think that I hope this show just helps people like cut through the fallacies they have, or like the cliches they have about what this experience was. I hope it gives people to kind of like understand the ways in which we still live with the kind of like behavioral practices and economic practices, in some ways that were cemented or even like originated in this time period. And like, cruelty is cruelty. We're capable of it at any time in history, even now, and I hope it sort of makes people kind of ask themselves like, how closely aligned am I to the good and bad actors of history, and am I a good and or bad actor in my own moment? Is there any other way to be? That's what I think the best sort of dramatic work helps you reassess in yourself. Like, what are the values of this community that call ourselves an audience or an us, but I could also just be completely delusional about that. Maybe it's just something to watch on the treadmill. I don't know what people do with their Hulu accounts.
Well, when Kindred will be the first, I believe, of what will be many adaptations that are actually in the works. I was saying at the beginning of the show that we seem to be in a Butler moment, and judging only from interest from TV and movies, Parable of the Sower, Fledgling, Wild Seed, and Dawn are all in various stages of development for movie or TV series, and that's not to mention graphic novel adaptations and things like that. And as I say, your show will be out there first. Any comment about why you think that is? I mean, or what it is about her work, which is speaking to, well, both creative people like you, but to audiences right now?
Yeah. I mean, I think because she was just ahead of her time, and that's the worst thing you could ever say about a writer, but she was doing the thinking that no one else was. And she was, she used to say that I'm not prophetic. All I do is look at the news and I imagine what the news means in 10 years. That's what she said her whole process was. I'm a little bit paraphrasing, but it's like, yeah, so it is possible to sort of extract from our present tense through fiction what our future might be like, what might be at stake in that future. And I think that I think that people are like hungry to understand what they missed, what they weren't paying attention to. I also feel that she, quiet as it's kept, she really inspired an enormous amount of young writers of color or minority writers in general, women writers. And I think that generation is coming of age. And I think for many of us, she felt like a really well-kept secret. My babysitter had to notice I was reading Brave Bradbury to sneak her paperback from me. I think that generation is coming of age now and saying, listen, this is someone who everybody slept on, but she is in some ways like an architect of this moment creatively. I think that's part of what it is too. But also television is finally in a place where it's ready to talk. Again, when we sold this, nobody was talking about her other books. Like, Marilee Heifetz, who was her literary executor, an amazing champion of her and just an amazing woman. She was saying like nobody cares about any of these other books except for Kindred, and here, everyone suddenly cares about all the books. You know what I mean? It's just people are now not afraid of what she's saying. People are ready to like take a risk to think about what a Black woman sci-fi writer might want us to pay attention to or read or watch or see, And it's so funny because her whole career began, her story very famously, that she was watching, I think, a really bad sci-fi television show, right? She was watching, I think this is what it is. She's watching a really bad show, the sci-fi, and she decided she was going to rewrite her ending. And that's her origin story as a writer. And I think it's so interesting now that like, finally those stories are like getting to the other side of that membrane. They're gonna hopefully be the things someone watches and someone else goes, I don't like that. And they write their own story, and that's how that's how the world is made, maybe.
That's great. Well, I mean, that's our hour actually. So
wow, I talked so much.
I know there's a lot to cover.
I feel so
a lot
guilty.
of questions also we didn't get to, and I apologize to the audience for that, but we kind of got engrossed, and I hope that the conversation answered some of the questions at least that you had. I know that people were also interested to hear about Butler's influence on your own work, and maybe as I say, that's a subject maybe for another conversation. Maybe we'll come back when the show is out and we can watch a clip and maybe talk a little bit more about some specifics if you have time. That would be great.
Yeah, and hopefully those other shows will be kind of deeper down the road, and there could be like a bigger nerd fest here. Maybe let's see what happens.
You could do that
6
too.
months.
Thanks, Branden. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Max.
You've been listening to Branden Jacobs-Jenkins on Octavia Butler's visionary science fiction novel Kindred, which he is adapting for an FX television series airing this fall. Kindred is published in Kindred, Fledgling and Collected Stories, volume number 338 in the Library of America series, edited by Nisi Shaw and Jerry Canavan. Please join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America. In March, LOA Live welcomes Elizabeth Samet, professor of English at West Point, for a conversation with historian Richard Frank about her new Library of America edition of 3 classic memoirs from World War II's Pacific Theater, published for the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. Details about this and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about Library of America's Octavia Butler and World War II memoirs volumes and links to purchase those and other editions of Great American Writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again to Branden Jacobs-Jenkins, and have a great evening.